Perspectives. I'm Meredith Jacobs, CEO of Jewish Women International and former editor in chief of the Washington Jewish Week. This week, I am joined by Laura Adkins, opinion editor for JTA, Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt, who is a journalist for The Forward and previously a writer for Haaretz. You'll have read her in the New York Times, Vox, and Salon. And our special guest this week is Jill Zuckman. Jill comes to us from SKD Knickerbocker, and she specializes in public affairs and crisis communications. But she really is a leading expert in corporate and complex issue based communications. She led the communications efforts to free Alan Gross, who I'm sure you all remember was a Jewish American in prison in Cuba for more than 5 years. Before joining SKDK, Jill was an award winning political correspondent and served as assistant to the Secretary and Director of Public Affairs for Transportation, Secretary Ray LaHood. Prior to serving in the Obama administration, Jill worked as a national political correspondent for the Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, and covered 4 presidential elections. So let's get started. Welcome, everyone. All right, I want to dig into the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, but really specifically how motherhood was used. There was an interesting article earlier this week in the New York Times, and it really talks about, gosh, from the first ladies being asked for their cookie recipe to Sarah Palin, hockey mom, to even Kamala's mamala, and now Amy Coney Barrett's minivan mom of 7 kids. I really want to look into how have we seen motherhood weaponized on both sides and how we've seen it deployed to advance a specific political agenda. So, Jill, I don't know if you want to
Sure.
kick us off on
Uh,
that.
I'm happy to jump in. Meredith, thanks for having us today. As part of my career covering Congress for the Chicago Tribune, the Boston Globe, I did cover 2 or 3 Supreme Court nomination confirmation battles on the Hill. And I will say that what is so patently obvious is I think the Republicans are trying to use her motherhood and her 7 kids to say, you don't have to be scared of her. She's a mommy. It seems pretty basic that they're trying to don't look over here. Just look at all the kids sitting behind her. So she's okay. You can trust her. That's my basic take on it. And the bottom line is this is, she seems like she's headed for confirmation, and there's not much the Democrats can do about it without the ability to filibuster. And, I think she's headed for the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think Jill is spot on. It's interesting. I don't necessarily align with Judge Barrett's politics at all, but she does come off as very soft and approachable. And we know that the vast majority of Americans, that's what they're looking and thinking about when they're evaluating politicians, not going line by line through her decisions over the years and her writings on a variety of issues. So I think it was very smart of President Trump to pick someone that maybe has more of the characteristics that you would think of from a liberal leader, right? Someone who leans hard on those soft power skills and comes across as very approachable. I think the GOP is more known for their hardline, very masculine form of politics. So I think it was a brilliant move, whether or not you like Judge Barrett, for them to pick someone who, at a time where President Trump is under attack for perceived racism and bigotry, someone who has 2 Black children, someone who is a woman, I think it was smart for those reasons. And partially because of that weaponization of femininity and motherhood, I certainly think that every female political leader faces an undue level of scrutiny, not just for their parenting decisions or not, but for their appearance and their, you know, various other life choices. So that was the least surprising thing, I guess, to me about this whole battle.
Yeah,
And I think Meredith,
go ahead.
sorry, I think just what you said in the introduction was true in that this isn't, I don't think this is in any way limited to one side of the political aisle in this country. I think this is the weaponization of motherhood is a very direct reflection of truly the vast majority of this country, which is, you know, sort of like this conservative, family-oriented, pronatalist, even amongst liberals. Family is greatly valued. So I think, you know, Kamala's Mamala, you know, is trying to appeal to that average American to sort of show, you know, she's not just a career woman. She also has this maternal side. So I don't know if it's limited to one party.
But what is it about women running for elected office or for the Supreme Court, not that they would run for it, but whatever, that makes them so threatening that they have to soften themselves through family or through motherhood? We're not looking for that from a man. The New York Times even talked about in Kavanaugh's hearing, he mentioned how he coached his daughter's softball teams, but that was it. There wasn't this big, oh, look what a great daddy he is. He's a family guy. Why aren't men held to the same standards? Why don't we have to look at, you know, how the men running for president are fathers in the same way that Kamala has to talk about her being a stepmother and cooking Sunday dinner as a way to make her more palatable for the American voter?
Go ahead, Jill.
Well, unfortunately, women have always been a lightning rod in politics. And, you know, people pick on them for what they wear and how they look in a way that they never talk about male politicians that way. You remember when Hillary Clinton famously said, well, I guess I could stay home and bake cookies, but I had a career. And you know, the country went crazy when Michelle Obama went to, I think it was the Grand Canyon with her family, and she was wearing shorts. People were appalled. Why is the First Lady wearing shorts? And so unfortunately, it's just not over. You know, we still treat male and female politicians differently. And I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah, look, I mean, as progressive as this country is in a variety of ways, we, through the course of our country's history, have had over 12,000 House of Representatives and Senators members, and we've had less than 400 of those that were women. So when you're looking at underrepresented groups or groups from which a small number have served in leadership positions, you're always going to be comparing them with what you know about that group. For instance, Michelle Obama and Kamala Harris are not necessarily that similar, but in people's minds, they're two Black women. So they're compared more often than they would be if one of them was, say, white, just because that's how our brains work. We like to categorize things. And for the vast majority of human history, women have been primarily mothers and taking care of domestic things, not leading the country. So I think as progressive as we want to think we are, we still default to thinking of women that way. So of course we're going to ask how they're taking care of their children. But also Judge Barrett has, you know, made a big part of her positioning publicly to highlight her children. That I think was a very intentional choice. The Republican Party is a lot more traditionalist than even the Democratic Party is in this country. So I think it's a big pro for that party, the vast majority of whom are evangelical Christians, to see someone who has a large family, who puts that at the center of their work. So I think it's both that we just naturally think of women that way, and also she's not doing anything to combat that notion.
And I think with Barrett, it's also to make it harder for people to think that she would actually do something to harm women's rights, even though we know from her rulings and her writings the way she feels. I remember a couple of years ago being at a table talking to somebody about oh my goodness, I'm blanking on her name. The woman who was the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, and they were talking about supporting her because of her views on Israel. And I said, well, you know, she's anti-choice. And this woman said to me, what are you talking about? She's a woman. And so just by virtue of the fact that she was a woman, therefore, there's no way she could be against choice. And I think Barrett's using motherhood also to try and hide her stances on women's rights. I want to change now really to the town halls last night. I almost said the debates last night, and really talking about our news bubbles. It was interesting when Trump was at Walter Reed and there were the people standing and congregating in front. There was a news camera on the crowd, and one of the MAGA guys yelled, "You libs don't know the truth." And I thought if anyone were to engage him in a conversation, it would go absolutely nowhere, because his version of the truth is very different from the truth, I'm going to say. So what I want to know, and I really want to start with Jill on this, because of your expertise in PR and public affairs, is in our news bubbles where we're only watching Biden's town hall or Trump's town hall, depending who you are already supporting. How do we start conversations going? Even if Biden wins, how do we get to a point where we're all watching the same news and we're all hearing the same truth and we're all, is there any hope, I guess?
Well, one of the things that I do work on is a project involving disinformation. And one of the things we do is we monitor for it, and then we try to push reporters to write stories when there's like patently, wrong stuff being disseminated or lies being circulated, to try to keep putting it at the top of reporters' inboxes. This is wrong. For example, Facebook until recently was allowing Holocaust deniers to post what they have to say on there. And it's only recently that Mark Zuckerberg has said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. Okay, really just waking up to that now? I mean, Facebook, as nice as it is to keep in touch with old friends and family and share pictures, it is the vehicle that is transmitting so much of this disinformation. And there's so much more that Facebook needs to do. All of the technology platforms need to be taking a much harder look at what's being transmitted here. I think it is a little bit of wishful thinking that we'll all be seeing news that's sort of in the same lane at any point. But I have to say, if Trump loses the election, I think you're going to see Fox News backpedaling quite a bit and trying to shift their tone a little bit. It's just a guess. I think it's even happening a little bit right now, but I'd be curious about what everybody else thinks.
Yeah, I think so too. One of the things that I've been noticing in my reporting, and most of my reporting in the last months have been focused very much on COVID and Orthodox community, is that sadly people are speaking two different languages of fact, and it's to my mind increasingly dangerous, and I mean putting people's lives literally at risk. For example, I've been seeing a lot of sorts of disinformation of just about the numbers, right? The data of cases in various regions. And when I hear sources, people I'm speaking with in the community saying, you know, at a certain point in an argument about whether COVID is real, their numbers aren't really trustworthy from the government. There's like a total like dismissal of just very basic, you know, there's no universally accepted truth about something as basic as numbers of cases, people sick with a viral disease. So, you know, it's life-threatening. It's literally life-threatening, and it's very concerning. I do agree with you, Jill, that I do think that with a Biden victory, we will see many of these conservative channels and commentators backpedaling a little bit, largely for access, right? They're going to want those interviews, and they're only going to get them if they adjust that tone.
Yeah, I think there's a big phenomenon that I've seen, particularly after Trump won the election, of this very parochial attitude among conservatives, given the impression, which is usually true, that the liberal, the tech world and the media world are predominantly liberal. There's this almost victim mentality of, the extreme example would be Facebook repressing QAnon conspiracy theories. Well, we also know that polling in September shows that 14% of registered Republicans believe in QAnon theories. So if Facebook is playing whack-a-mole with these views that they find dangerous, that can be also fuel for these fringe groups. I mean, we've seen that in how anti-Semitism metastasizes in all of these groups like 8chan and 4chan. When mainstream tech companies or mainstream outlets stop covering something or prevent people from talking about it, I think that there's a big school of thought that that's actually dangerous. We had a long interview with Nadine Strawson, former head of the ACLU, in JTA recently, and she advocates for counter speech instead of suppression of even really harmful ideas like Holocaust denial. However, that's very difficult in the reality we are in, which is that people aren't going to the same places for news. I think the story on Hunter Biden's alleged issues and fraud is a great example. Half of my Twitter feed of conservatives was horrified that Twitter took down the New York Post's reporting about that story, and half of my Twitter feed was horrified that people would be reading a story from the New York Post and taking their reporting seriously. So we can't even agree on standards of truth. I think in past generations, you know, if there was an op-ed in, say, the New York Times that you hated, you might hate it, but you didn't delegitimize the New York Times. And now we don't even read the same newspapers by and large. So that makes, you know, deplatforming harmful ideologies really harmful because there's other places for them to go.
Right, and all those various news outlets have allowed us to create our news bubbles. You know, when you mentioned a couple generations ago, everyone watched the same 3 news channels on television to get their evening news. There wasn't an option, and we just can't break the bubble. So Jill, when you're doing these campaigns, when you're talking to reporters, are you reaching reporters who are, I don't know, covering QAnon stuff, or is there a way that you're getting through to those
well,
readers who don't?
you know, there are lots of different kinds of reporters who are covering different things, and the people that we're focused on are reporters who write about the media, because we want to keep this at the top of their, you know, top of mind, top of their list. You know, we want to make sure that if they're writing regularly, some media reporters have blogs, some have newsletters. We want to keep that drumbeat going, that disinformation is dangerous, that it can cost lives, as in COVID, as in attempts on people's lives, like George Soros and the pipe bomb that was sent to his house. I mean, there are just so many ramifications. I don't know You remember when in Washington, D.C., the pizza place in Northwest Washington, the man from North Carolina who was reading all the QAnon material, drove up here and stormed it with a gun because he thought there were pedophiles in the basement. I mean, there are really dangerous ramifications to this. And I don't think there are any easy answers. I do think sunshine is usually the best disinfectant. So calling things out, providing the truth, but there are outlets that they live to keep pushing all of this untrue information.
Even the Trump town hall last night, when he wouldn't disavow QAnon and just said, "Oh, they're fighting pedophilia." Like, what a great organization, and
yeah,
makes you want to scream.
Okay, right, and I think that's and that's what's most troubling, because until recently, we always, not always, but for many years, we had these very marginal, extreme views being pushed online, and when it is, when it gets a kosher certification from the very top, that's when things get really out of hand.
So I want to turn to voting and Jewish organizational efforts to turn out the vote, but also protect free and fair elections. Right before this, was on a webinar with the heads of major Jewish organizations because the Littman Camphor Foundation just launched their freeandfair.org website, which is wonderful. They're encouraging organizations to close their doors on November 3rd, not only to allow staff to vote, but perhaps more importantly, to allow younger staff to serve as election judges or poll workers, and really just to make a statement that we should be closed to allow people to vote more easily, as well as different resources. And a conversation ensued talking about how the organizations were getting pushback from their members, in one case for co-sponsoring an event that was a memorial to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and another for an event that actually JWI, along with Hadassah and NCJW, are holding later today at 3:30 Eastern, called Jewish Women Vote, which has rabbis from all denominations, as well as Deborah Messing, coming and talking about the power of our voice as Jewish women to vote and create change. So what I'm wondering is, since when did when did democracy and voting become something that is tearing apart our Jewish organizational world? And what can we do about it? So whoever wants to jump in here.
Look, I think that keeping people from voting is unfortunately a foundational American thing. Going way back to the debate over whether each state should have 2 representatives or representatives proportionate to their population, whether or not non-landowners can vote, whether or not Black people can vote, whether or not women can vote. So, if you can't beat people in an election, blocking them is another way to take power. And to give a tiny bit of credit to those who are pushing back against get out the vote efforts, I think in today's day and age where we have such pervasive gerrymandering, the group that does benefit from increasing access to voting for everyone is usually the Democratic Party, because groups that traditionally support the Democratic Party are often also groups that are highly disenfranchised. So I think that that's where the pushback comes from. That being said, I think it's bad that we've gotten to that state of affairs where that's the reality, that it should even be a question of whether or not we should be increasing voting access. So I see where the detractors are coming from, but I also think that the problem shouldn't exist in the first place. So anything to mitigate that problem should be universally supported.
Jill, if you were to give messaging advice to the Jewish organizations, what would you have them say?
Well, I think it's important to remember that voting has always been a nonpartisan practice in our country. It's part of our democracy and our heritage. And, the League of Women Voters, the volunteers that have always worked at the polls, these are not people who are on the right or the left. They're just there to help their friends and neighbors cast a ballot. And I think we all need to get back to that point in time where we remember that's what it's all about. Everybody just needs to have their say and to be able to vote. And, it's very, very unfortunate, all these attempts to tighten up on who can vote or putting hurdles in people's way. I remember when I was just out of college, I spent a couple of years living in Wisconsin, and I was amazed. I went to the poll, I registered right there, and then I voted. I didn't have to go through anything elaborate. They tried to make it as easy as possible because they wanted people to vote. And the idea that we're somehow now throwing barriers and putting tests up and checking all sorts of things. I mean, it's a terrible place to be. And I think we all need to get back to that place where we thought about this as a nonpartisan responsibility about all citizens.
Avital, anything before we wrap up
Yeah.
for the day?
It honestly boggles my mind that it's even a debate, right? I mean, this is a nonpartisan. This should be a nonpartisan movement, and the fact that it isn't right now really reflects on the sorry state that we are in. Sorry to be so dark, but it really shocks me that there is such pushback as you described.
I know that Biden said last night in his town hall that he really thought that once the kind of bullying coming from Trump ended, forcing GOP to fall in line, would kind of free up some bipartisan action. And I did find some hope in that. And maybe if we're seeing that in any way from our leaders, that will trickle down. Things will get a little bit better. Who knows? Not completely better, but a little bit better. We need Walter Cronkite back. But I just want to thank everyone. I want to remind everyone watching to please join JWI, NCJW, Hadassah, and I think every single major Jewish women's organization today at 3:30 Eastern for a celebration of the power of the voice of Jewish women in our Jewish Women Vote. I know that Rachel just dropped the URL into the chat in the email that follows up to everyone who's registered, along with the recording of today's session. You'll also find a link to join us. It's not too late. You have a couple hours. Come back at 3:30 Eastern today. And did I mention Deborah Messing will be our special guest? So I thank you all. I wish you a good Shabbat, a wonderful weekend. I wish you safety and health. I thank our incredible panelists once again for joining us. And we will see you all next Friday. Thank you.
Thanks, Meredith.
Thank you.